Okay, let's dive into something that really opens up a lot of doors. Applying for a Canadian work permit. We've got this fantastic article you shared, really detailed, and it does a great job breaking down what can feel like, well, a pretty complex process.
It absolutely can feel that way. There are definitely, layers to peel back, different programs, different permit types.
Yeah.
But what this source material does so well is kind of boil it down. It feels like a set of simple, understandable steps.
Right.
And our goal here in this deep dive is to sort of unpack all that, pull out the key insights, and show you what really matters.
Exactly. Because if you can cut through that complexity, the potential here is just huge.
It really is.
I mean, the article mentions thousands of jobs available, options for both skilled and unskilled workers, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And this is a big one. The chance for your spouse or partner to get an open work permit, and for your kids to go to school without needing their own study permits.
That's a major draw for many people. And what's really fascinating, and the source points this out, is that getting this temporary work experience, it's not necessarily just about the short term. It can actually be a strategic move, potentially paving the way to apply for permanent residence later on.
A stepping stone, then.
Exactly. A potential stepping stone to a longer future in Canada.
Okay, so where do we even begin this journey? According to the article, understanding these permits starts with knowing the main players involved, government-wise?
That's right. You've basically got two main departments you'll interact with, or whose rules matter.
Okay.
There's Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. Everyone knows them as IRCC. They handle the immigration side, the permits themselves.
Right, IRCC.
And then there's Employment and Social Development Canada, or ESDC. They're focused more on the Canadian job market aspect.
Okay.
And they work together, essentially, to manage how temporary workers come into the country.
So one of the big programs they manage is the Temporary Foreign Work Permit Program, the TFWP. What's the main idea behind that one?
So the TFWP is really designed to help Canadian employers when they genuinely can't find a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident to fill a job. It's about addressing labor shortages.
Makes sense.
But importantly, it's also there to protect the rights of the temporary foreign workers themselves. Things like fair pay, safe conditions.
Okay, so that need to prove a Canadian wasn't available. That sounds like it leads straight to this term, LMIA, Labor Market Impact Assessment.
Exactly. The LMIA is, it's a document. It's issued by ESDC, the Labor Department folks.
Okay.
And it basically confirms that the employer tried to hire locally first, and that bringing in a foreign worker won't negatively affect the Canadian job market.
So it's proof they really needed someone from outside Canada.
Pretty much, yeah. Proof they did their homework trying to hire locally.
And is that something the employer deals with?
Oh, absolutely. The employer has to apply for and get the LMIA approved. That's their responsibility. But, and this is crucial, the source stresses this, if your job needs an LMIA, you, the applicant, you need a copy of that approved LMIA to include with your work permit application to IRCC.
Got it. Okay. So that's TFWP, often needing that LMIA proof from the employer. What about the other big program mentioned, the International Mobility Program?
Right, the IMP. Now, this program is for temporary workers whose jobs or situations don't require an LMIA.
Ah, okay. So LMIA exempt.
Exactly. These exemptions usually come from broader Canadian interests, things like international agreements, maybe significant benefit to Canada, cultural exchanges, reasons where the direct labor market test isn't the main point.
And the article highlights a big practical difference here. It says IMP applications can often be, easier and maybe much faster, sometimes processed in just 2 weeks.
That's a huge point. Yes, because you skip that whole LMIA step, which itself takes time, the IMP process can be significantly quicker. That 2-week figure is often cited for certain streams when everything's perfectly in order.
Wow, okay. That speed could definitely change how someone approaches this.
Absolutely. Knowing if a job falls under TFWP, likely needing an LMIA or IMP likely faster, is pretty critical information early on.
So let's say you've figured out the program side. Now, the actual permit you get, the source talks about two main flavors, open and employer-specific.
Correct. And they offer very different levels of flexibility once you're actually working in Canada.
An open work permit Sounds pretty flexible. What's the deal there?
Is largely what it says on the tin. An open work permit lets you work for almost any employer, anywhere across Canada.
Almost any.
Yeah. The article notes a couple of exceptions, like employers who've been flagged as non-compliant or certain specific types of adult entertainment businesses. But generally, it's wide open. Huge flexibility.
Okay, freedom to move around, change jobs. Makes sense. What about the employer-specific one?
This one, as the name suggests, is tied down.
Right.
When you receive this permit, it will clearly state the name of the specific employer you're allowed to work for. It might also specify the location you have to work at and definitely the period you're allowed to work.
And this is the type you'd usually get if an LMIA was involved.
Typically, yes. If it's under the TFWP with an LMIA, you'll get an employer-specific permit. Or sometimes even under the IMP, if it's an LMIA exempt job, but still tied to a specific offer, like through a trade agreement, for instance.
Okay. Yeah, how does someone even know if they're eligible for any of this? The source mentions eligibility depends on a whole bunch of things.
It's definitely not a single checklist. It's very personal. Things like your age, the type of work you plan to do, your country of citizenship or residence, your current immigration status, even where you're applying from inside or outside Canada, it all matters.
And your skills, obviously.
And your skills and qualifications, absolutely. It's quite nuanced.
So what's the best first step then, just to see if you might qualify?
The article really pushes using the official online eligibility assessment tools on the Canadian government website. That's the fastest way to get a personalized idea of which pathways might be open to you.
Good tip. Okay, let's dig into some of those specific pathways the source details. Within the TFWP, it seems they categorize things partly by wage level.
They do. You've got the high-wage worker stream. That's for jobs paying at or above the median hourly wage for that province or territory.
Okay.
And then the low-wage worker stream for jobs paying below that median. It helps manage different kinds of labor needs.
And agriculture gets special mention, right?
Yeah.
Specific streams there.
Definitely. Agriculture is a big one. There's a general agricultural stream and also the very specific seasonal agricultural worker program, known as SAWP.
Yeah.
The article even lists the types of work covered: fruits, veggies, mushrooms, livestock like cattle, sheep, pigs, beekeeping.
Wow, specific.
And for SAWP, it's seasonal, up to 8 months, and it involves specific agreements with certain countries. Mexico's a big one, and many Caribbean nations like Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and others listed in the source.
Okay. The source also highlights home support workers. Is there a specific route for caregivers?
Yes, there is. Since 2019, they launched the Home Child Care Provider Pilot and the Home Support Worker Pilot.
And these are interesting because
What's really key about these, according to the source, is that they're designed as direct pathways to permanent residence. The idea is you come as a temporary worker in one of these caregiver roles, get 24 months of Canadian work experience, and then you can apply for PR.
so it's a built-in temporary to permanent route.
Exactly. Very intentional.
What about people already in Canada, like international students or researchers? Any work options for them?
Yes. International students who are studying full-time at a designated institution, they can usually work off campus.
Without a separate work permit?
Right, without a separate work permit. But there are limits, typically up to 20 hours per week during the school semester and full-time during scheduled breaks, like summer.
Okay.
If they wanted to work more than 20 hours during the term, then they generally need a work permit.
And researchers?
Researchers might get short exemptions, like if they're at a public university for less than 120 days for a specific project. But for longer-term research work, they typically need a work permit, possibly under the IMP.
Gotcha. Okay, switching over to the IMP side, the LMIA exempt side. A really popular one, especially for younger folks, seems to be International Experience Canada, or IEC.
Oh, IEC is huge.
Yeah.
It's designed for young adults, usually 18 up to 30 or 35, depending on the country. Canada has agreements with about 37 countries for this.
And it has different categories within it.
It does. There are three main ones. Working holiday, which is fantastic because it usually gives you an open work permit.
Nice.
Then there's young professionals and international co-op. Those two usually result in employer-specific permits because they're tied to a prearranged job or internship.
Okay. And what about international students after they finish their studies in Canada? Is there something for them?
Yes, and this is incredibly valuable. It's the post-graduation work permit, or PGWP. Right. If you graduate from an eligible program, usually at least 8 months long at a Canadian Designated Learning Institution, the DLI, and your study permit is still valid when you apply, you can potentially get this PGWP.
And is it open or employer specific?
It's an open work permit. Really key for graduates to get that initial Canadian work experience, often for up to 3 years, depending on their study program length.
That sounds like a major pathway. Okay, and for neighbors, U.S. and Mexico, there's CUSMA, the trade agreement.
Correct. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, CUSMA, has provisions that make it easier for certain professionals, traders, investors, and people transferring within a company to get employer-specific work permits to work in Canada.
Kind of like NAFTA before it.
Exactly. It builds on that foundation. And the article mentions Canada has similar pathways through other trade agreements too, like CETA with Europe.
Okay, so lots of specific streams. But the source also mentions some general requirements that apply to pretty much everyone applying for a work permit.
Yeah, the standard checks IRCC will do. You need to satisfy an officer that you'll actually leave Canada when your permit expires.
Right.
You need to show you have enough money to take care of yourself and any family members coming with you during your stay.
Proof of funds.
Proof of funds, exactly. You need to show you obey the law, have no criminal record, usually means getting a police clearance certificate.
Okay.
You need to be in good health, maybe need a medical exam depending on the job or where you've lived. And crucially, not plan to work for an employer who's on that ineligible list we mentioned earlier.
Plus any specific documents for your stream, of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And be ready to provide anything else they ask for.
Now, here's where the source throws a real curveball, I thought. It says some people can actually work temporarily in Canada without needing a work permit at all.
Yeah, it seems totally counterintuitive after talking all about permits, right?
Really?
But yes, there are very specific, quite narrow exemptions, usually tied to the type of work and, critically, the short duration.
But they still need to be allowed into Canada, presumably.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Even without needing a work permit, they likely still need either a temporary resident visa, TRV, or an electronic travel authorization, ETA, depending on their nationality, just to get on the plane and enter the country. The permit exemption is just about the work part.
So who fits into this special category? The examples were kind of surprising.
They really are diverse. The source lists things like athletes or coaches coming just for a specific competition.
Okay.
Business visitors, this is key people coming for meetings, site inspections, negotiating deals, but not actually doing hands-on work or entering the Canadian labor market directly.
Right, just visiting for business purposes.
Exactly. Crew members on things like planes, ships, trucks crossing the border internationally. Emergency service providers like firefighters coming to help during a major disaster.
Wow.
Performing artists, but for limited gigs, theater runs, circus performers, maybe guest spots on TV or radio.
Public speakers too, but with a time limit.
Yeah, the source says for events no longer than 5 days. Also, religious leaders, if they're mainly leading worship or providing spiritual guidance.
And there was something about highly skilled workers too, but again, very short term.
That's right. This is for people in jobs classified under Canada's system, the NOC system, as skill type 0, which is management, or skill level A, usually professional jobs requiring a degree.
Okay.
They might be exempt for super short work stints. The rule mentioned is up to 15 consecutive days once every 6 months, or up to 30 consecutive days once every year. It's very limited.
And short-term researchers.
Similar idea. Researchers coming to a public degree-granting institution might be exempt if their stay is 120 consecutive days or less.
And we already touched on students working off campus within limits.
Right, the course reiterates that one. Full-time students meeting the criteria can do their 20 hours during school, full-time during breaks. No separate work permit needed for that specific work.
So the big takeaway here is, most temporary work needs a permit, but don't assume everyone does. There are these very specific, narrow exceptions based mostly on the job type and how short the stay is.
Exactly. Always check the official rules for your specific situation.
All right, so let's say you figured out your eligibility. Maybe you have a job offer, you know you need a permit. What's the actual application process look like these days, according to the source?
Well, the big thing is it's mostly done online now. The article is clear that's the standard way and likely how everything will be going forward.
Okay, online application. What kinds of documents do you generally need to get ready?
You'll definitely need your basics.
Yeah.
A valid passport or travel document, usually some recent photos meeting specific requirements.
Standard stuff.
Yeah. Proof that you actually meet the requirements for the job you're going to do or the program stream you're applying under. Proof of funds showing you can support yourself. The source specifically flags this as important for IEC applicants. Police clearance certificates. This is important.
Right.
From any country where you've lived for 6 months or more in the last 10 years. and they need to be recent.
Right, got to gather those.
And if you have family coming with you, documents to prove those relationships, like marriage certificates, birth certificates.
Okay, that's the general list. What about documents specific to the type of permit?
Right, that depends. If your job needed that LMIA we talked about, you need two things. A copy of the positive LMIA confirmation letter from the ESDC and a copy of your actual job offer from the employer.
Both.
Both. Now, if it was an LMIA exempt job, but still required a specific offer.
Like under IMP?
Yeah, possibly. Then you typically need the offer of employment document. The form is often called IMM 5802. Or you might just have an offer of employment ID number from the employer portal, plus usually a copy of your signed employment contract.
Okay. And other situations, like if you were nominated by a province?
Then you'd need to include the official nomination certificate or letter from that province.
And for the post-graduation work permit, PGWP.
For that one, you need proof you actually finished your studies. So your final transcript and an official letter or notice from your school confirming graduation.
Makes sense. And you also have to fill out specific government forms, right? IRCC forms.
Oh yeah. There are core application forms like the IMM 1295, which is the main application for a work permit made outside Canada. And often others, like IMM 5707 for family details, you need to fill them out completely and accurately. Sign them where needed.
What about biometrics? Fingerprints and photos?
Usually, yes. Biometrics are generally required unless you've already given them for a Canadian application within the past 10 years. And keep in mind, there are fees involved both for the main application processing and separately for the biometrics collection.
Okay, so you gather everything, submit it online, pay the fees. Let's say it's approved. What happens next? Do they just mail you the work permit?
No, and this is a really important point the source makes. If your application is approved, you'll get some kind of notification, usually a confirmation letter or approval letter from IRCC. But that letter itself, that is not your work permit.
Yeah.
The actual official work permit document is issued to you when you arrive in Canada. It's the Border Services Officer, the CBSA officer at the airport or land border, who reviews your approval letter and passport, and then prints and gives you the physical work permit.
Okay, so you get it upon entry.
Exactly. And that physical permit is the crucial document. It lists all the conditions, who you can work for, if it's employer specific, what kind of work, potentially where you can work, and critically the expiry date.
So getting that online application package right the first time sounds pretty important to avoid any problems when you actually arrive.
Absolutely critical. The source really emphasizes this. Incomplete applications, missing documents, mistakes, that's what causes major delays or even refusals. Double-checking everything before you hit submit is key.
Okay, good to know. Now, switching gears a bit towards the end here, thinking about the jobs themselves, the source highlights that there are lots of temporary work opportunities available in Canada.
Yes, and finding that work, maybe even ongoing temporary work, can be really important if you want to stay longer and maybe renew your permit down the line.
The article makes kind of an interesting observation. It says, quote, lower paying jobs are much easier to get as a foreigner. But then it clarifies that even these roles offer a, quote, good salary, around $30,000 per annum.
Yeah, that's an interesting framing, isn't it?
It is. It reframes what lower paying means in this context.
It really does, because $30,000 Canadian might be lower relative to some high-skilled professions, but depending on the cost of living where you are, it can still be a decent livable wage and maybe significantly better than options back home for some people.
Right. And they actually list some concrete examples of these kinds of in-demand temporary jobs with average salaries to give people a real sense.
They do. It gives a good picture of the range. They mention things like caregivers, averaging maybe $36,000 a year.
Yeah.
General laborers, closer to $32,000.
Okay.
But also administrative assistants, which they peg near $45,000. Housekeepers around $31,000. Ranch hands, interestingly, $41,600. Cooks, maybe $34,000.
Wow, quite a mix.
Yeah. Delivery workers, $43,000-ish. Even things like ski instructors, potentially over $55,000, or massage therapists around $46,000. It shows the variety the source talks about.
That's helpful context. Okay, just to wrap up some quick facts, the source had a nice little asked and answered bit. Processing time, what's the general idea?
Well, they mention it can be as fast as 2 weeks, especially for priority processing if everything is perfect. But realistically, it varies a lot by application type and where you're applying from.
Okay, and how long is a typical permit valid for?
Often around 24 months, 2 years. is mentioned as typical. But again, it really depends on the job offer duration, the LMIA validity if there was one, or the specific program rules.
Got it. Application location.
Primarily online these days, that's the main way.
And family, can they come along?
Generally, yes. The source confirms dependent spouse, common law partner, dependent kids, sometimes even parents can often accompany the main work permit holder, as long as you can show you meet the financial requirements to support them, and they meet admissibility requirements too.
That's a huge plus for many people.
Definitely.
So, wow, we've really covered a lot of ground here. We've journeyed through the whole Canadian work permit system, basically, from understanding the government programs behind it all, TFWP and IMP.
The two main types of permits, open versus employer-specific.
Right, and then diving into all those different eligibility streams, agriculture, caregivers, students, IEC, PGWP.
And even those surprising exemptions where you don't need a permit.
Yeah, that was interesting. Then the actual nuts and bolts of applying the documents, the online process, getting the permit at the border.
And finally, a look at the kinds of temporary jobs that might be available, according to the source.
It's clear how this source material really helps break down what seems like a massive, complicated thing into, well, more manageable pieces.
It really does demystify it quite a bit.
And going back to that point we started with about this maybe being more than just temporary work, the source leaves us with a really powerful thought to consider, doesn't it?
It does.
Think about how gaining that Canadian work experience, even if it starts with a temporary permit, even in one of those lower paying but decent jobs, how that could be the most strategic first step towards potentially building a permanent future in Canada later on.
Yeah, it really makes you think differently about it. It raises this question for you, the listener. As you look at these different temporary work options that the source highlights, how might you choose a path? Not just based on the job itself right now, but thinking ahead. Which type of Canadian work experience would best set you up if your long-term goal is maybe permanent residency?
Right. It turns that temporary permit application into potentially the first very deliberate move on a much longer journey.
Exactly. Food for thought.